All right, just three more chapters. We have learned about the missing children from history. We know that these were children that were taken because of horrendous circumstances that have happened to them in history. Um, they have been taken and moved to a different place in time and adopted out as babies. And Jonah is now going to want to know, who in the world is he? Who was he in the past? 31. Which one am I? Jonah demanded, but his voice got lost in the sea of voices around him, all calling out the same question and shouting, "How could it be? That's not possible. I can't believe it." "Believe it," JB said, his voice carrying over the shouts. "It's true." Incredibly, Mr. Hodge was nodding too. "Virginia Dare," he said, "first child born of English parents in the Americas, who vanished with the rest of the Roanoke colony. Edward and Richard, the British princes who vanished from the Tower of London in 1483. Anastasia and Alexis, the two youngest children of Tsar Nicholas II, who disappeared during the Russian Revolution. The kidnapped Lindbergh baby, the so-called Eaglet. It was the best rescue mission ever." "It was your worst rescue mission ever," JB retorted. If we hadn't discovered how to hold back the ripple just temporarily, just until we can heal all the wounds, until we can return the children to their rightful place in history." Jonah's head was spinning. He knew he should be paying attention, listening closely. He had the feeling that JB had just said something important, but he couldn't quite grasp what he meant, couldn't quite understand. "What?" This was Catherine exploding. "You want to send everyone back in time?" Oh, that was what JB meant. This was important, all right. Suddenly, the whole room was quiet, everyone stunned into silence at once. Catherine turned the elucidator away from the wall, aiming it at JB once more. "You can't do that," she said. "I won't let you." JB held out his hands apologetically, a particularly pitiful gesture with his wrists bound. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wish there were some other way. It's not fair to any of you, but some of you are royalty, or the children of explorers. You can understand the need to sacrifice for your country, to take risks for all humankind. This is even more important. Yes, returning you to history may be dangerous for many of you, even deadly. But think of it as your chance to save the world, to give your own life in order to help every other person on the planet for all time." Someone began clapping. It was Mr. Hodge. "Oh, very noble," he said sarcastically, his clapping too slow and exaggerated to be sincere. "What a pretty speech. But you forgot, my friend, that these children haven't been raised as royalty or as sacrificial lambs. They think of themselves as 21st century Americans. They're selfish, spoiled, overprivileged, the richest society in history up to this point. They aren't capable of sacrifice." Jonah waited for some kid to speak out, to complain. "We're not selfish," but nobody said a word. They were all watching Mr. Hodge. Jonah waited for, what I'm offering, myself and Gary, that is the glorious future. Even more privilege than you've ever imagined. Technology beyond your wildest dreams. I mean, we have time travel. You can be sure that the video games will be truly awesome." His eyes seemed to twinkle hypnotically. "I just want to complete my original mission. The ripple effect he's so worried about," he pointed to JB jeeringly. "Pah! You won't even feel it." He took a hop step toward Catherine. He seemed barely constrained by the ropes around his ankles. "We've worked so hard to bring you all together again," he said softly now. "The time crash put 13 years off limits, but we came back for you as soon as we could. Just hand me the elucidator, sweetie, and we can all be on our way. There are families waiting for you." Catherine jerked the elucidator back, away from Mr. Hodge. "All the kids already have families," she said coldly. She stared defiantly toward Jonah, as if she expected him to spring to her side, to link arms and agree. "Yeah, what she said." But he didn't move. "And if we do what you want, we'd have to go back to being babies again?" a voice said quietly from the crowd. Jonah looked back. It was Andrea Kroll, the girl with braids. "We'd have to forget everything? Forget our entire lives? Forget everyone we've ever known?" "Well, yes, but it's not like you'd even remember that you'd forgotten anything," Mr. Hodge said, looking uncomfortable. You'd be perfectly happy in the future, I promise. Jonah looked from Mr. Hodge to JB. Both of them were staring back at him as if they expected him to make some sort of decision. He glanced back over his shoulder. Several of the other kids were peering anxiously toward him as well. Why? Oh, yeah, Jonah thought. I did kind of take charge before, grabbing the elucidator, capturing Angela, opening the door, closing the door. He felt like climbing up on top of the bench and calling out, hey, guess what? I'm good at quick things, snap decisions, rash actions. That's all. This one's too big for me. Someone would have to think about this for a long, long time, and that's not my department. But no one else was talking. Jonah sighed. What if we just want to stay in our own time? He asked. This is where we belong, the 21st century, I mean. But the future's even better, Mr. Hodge said, as JB interjected. No, you really don't belong in the 21st century. Yes, we do, Jonah said stubbornly. JB shook his head. It was a mistake. All of you ending up where you are now, when you did. Hodge was carrying this load of stolen babies to the future. And we, those of us who enforce the laws of time travel, we knew we had to stop him as soon as we could. There's a protocol to stopping in the middle of the time stream. Steps everyone agrees to avoid doing even more damage. And Hodge broke that every rule. Okay, so think about that. What he's saying is that plane was traveling to the future. Mr. Hodge was taking that plane to the future of all those babies, and they stopped it. They stopped it in time because he was breaking the rules. And so that's when they got stopped and they got set on that in that airplane. They were as babies in the airport when Angela found them. It was a mistake. They were stopped in time travel. Oh, come on now. That's impossible, Hodge said mockingly. You time fanatics have so many rules. It'd take an eternity to break them all. JB glared at Hodge. Jonah could hear a few kids in the back of the room, snickering. I'm not explaining this well enough, JB said, looking back at Jonah. It's really complicated, but I'll try to put it into terms you can understand. It'd be like a criminal kidnapping a bunch of babies in New York City and trying to fly them to Los Angeles. But when he's caught in the middle of the country, he refuses to give up. Instead, he crash lands in Kansas City, sets off a nuclear weapon that completely destroys the Midwest. He paused, looking down at the ropes again around his wrists, and then he peered up again earnestly. I'm trying to undo that nuclear explosion. Everyone was silent for a long moment, and then Catherine complained. That's a stupid comparison. A New York nuclear explosion in Kansas City would kill all the stolen babies, too. Other kids began muttering as well. Jonah heard Alex say, but the nuclear fallout blowing toward Los Angeles would be the kind of like the time ripple thing he was talking about. Jonah held up his hand, and to his amazement, everyone stopped talking. Okay, I get it, that nobody planned for us to end up here, he said. That's what happened, and so we've lived our lives in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so this is where we belong now. It's what we know. It's where our families are. His eyes skimmed over Catherine's face as he said it. She smiled encouragingly. Look, Jonah peered at Mr. Hodge. You're just going to have to find some other babies for those families in the future. And you? He turned his attention to JB. You're going to have to figure out some other way to fix the ripple, to save time. I'm sure you can think of something. I don't know about the other kids, but I'm staying here. This would have come off very well, very dramatically, except that he realized he wasn't exactly saying the right thing and was forced to add weakly, I mean, I'm staying now, whatever, you know what I mean. Mr. Hodge smiled slyly. That's what I've always loved about 21st century Americans, he said. They're always so convinced that they can control their own destinies. Go on then, walk out that door. Have a nice life. And then Jonah remembered the nothingness on the other side of the door. The fact that the 21st century and everything else outside the cave had disappeared. Tell me the code to go home, he said. Please. Mr. Hodge shook his head. Jonah turned to JB. After a second's hesitation, JB began shaking his head too. You're going to have to choose, he said. Your now is off limits. Which will it be? The future or the past? Chapter 32. Now you can pause here if you want to take a break, but I'm going to keep going. And then we're going to read to 32 today, and then we will pause and have our last chapter tomorrow. Nobody got hungry. Nobody had to go to the bathroom. Those were the good things. But also, nobody could leave the cave. Nobody could go back to their regular lives, see their parents again, talk to their usual friends, or grow up. Before, Jonah had had no sense of time stopping. He'd been too busy, crashing to the floor, grabbing for the elucidator, running for the ropes. But now, time, or really the lack of it, hung heavily on him. He didn't even care anymore about finding out which missing child from history he actually was. The other kids were no more motivated. Everyone sat around completely enervated. Enervated. Now that's a word I'm going to have to look up. I don't know that word. You know that saying about how time flies when you're having fun? Emily, the girl who had been so soothing before, asked as she plucked pointlessly at her sweatshirt sleeve. Yeah, Jonah said. I thought the opposite of that was the last 5 minutes of math class, when the teacher's going on and on about the decimals. She said. She yawned. I didn't know it could be this bad. Yeah, Jonah said. He thought about adding, I know what you mean, but it didn't seem to be worth the effort. Think, he commanded himself in disgust. Make a decision, future or past or future. He couldn't decide. It was like taking one of those multiple choice tests in school when he wasn't sure of the answer, so he tried eliminating all the choices he was sure were wrong, and then discovered that there were no possible right answers left. Going to the future would mean giving up everything. For that matter, so would going to the past. And probably dying on top of everything else. He couldn't get the images out of his head, all of those brutal deaths from history, the chopped off heads, the sword slicing flesh, the hail of gunfire raining down on children. I'm a coward, he whispered to himself. I don't want to die, especially not like that. But he'd been raised by such nerdy square parents who dragged him off to Sunday school and Boy Scout meetings and had talked so seriously about how important it was to be a good person. Because of that, he kind of felt like JB had the best argument. JB wanted to save the world. Mr. Hodge and Gary didn't seem to care. I don't want to die, he muttered a little more loudly this time. Maybe if everyone agreed to go back to the past, he'd be one of the lucky ones. Maybe he'd be someone who just kind of accidentally vanished from history, who still had a good life waiting for him in the past. Maybe he was one of those British princes. He could get used to chomping down on a huge turkey leg like some old-time king in a movie, couldn't he? Living in a castle, having thousands of soldiers at his command. And he looked around. He didn't want any of the other kids to die either. Angela caught his eye. Cautiously, as if she were trying not to be seen by anyone else, she raised an eyebrow and mouthed something. Walk? What did that mean? Oh, no, maybe it was talk. What good was that? How could they talk when they were still sitting right next to JB? Jonah remembered Catherine was still holding the elucidator. Chip still had the taser in his hand, and they still had some control. Jonah stood up. We're facing a very important choice, he said. Wonderful, he thought. I sound like someone running for 7th grade student council. But everyone was staring at him now. He had to go on. And yet, we don't know if we can trust the information we've been given. He turned to face the adults. How do we know you're not all working together? JB and Mr. Hodge looked at him like he'd gone crazy. It was kind of a no-brainer. Jonah was absolutely certain that those two weren't on the same side. Still, Jonah forged ahead. So we're going to take each of you to a different corner of the room and talk to you individually, he said. What good did that do? One of the other kids jeered. It figured. It was one of the kids in the black sweatshirts with the skulls on the back. Jonah shrugged. I think it's worth a try, he said. It's better than sitting around and doing nothing. Somehow that energized the other kids. Within 5 minutes, or what would have been 5 minutes if time had been moving, one group of kids was clustered around Gary in the front right part of the cave and another around Mr. Hodge in the front left. Chip was with JB and a few others in the back right corner. And Jonah, Catherine, Alex, and Emily were in the group with Angela in the back left. Quick, what do you think we should do? Jonah hissed. One look at Angela's face. Anguished face killed his hopes. I don't know much more about this time travel stuff than you do, she said. I can tell you this. The man you keep calling JB is sincere. The Hodge character doesn't seem very trustworthy. Great. Jonah had managed to figure that all out by himself. What's JB's real name? Catherine asked. Names in the future are very weird, Angela said. I can hardly pronounce it. It's something like Alonzo Alfred Aloysius Kita. You might as well keep calling him JB. How far in the future are we talking about? Emily asked. He won't tell me. He says I've already been contaminated enough. She grinned. He says I was supposed to marry a plumber and have 5 kids. I told him, I don't think so. He must have had me mixed up with somebody else. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe JB and Hodge and Gary had Jonah mixed up with somebody else too. Wouldn't it be nice to just have ordinary birth parents, confused high school kids maybe, who realized that they weren't mature enough to raise a child themselves? Where did you go that day in the library? Catherine asked Angela. Jonah saw you disappear. Oh, you mean earlier this afternoon? Angela asked. No, it was like 3 weeks ago, Catherine said. Angela stared at her in disbelief. Get out, she said. Really? She shook her head. This time stuff can really mess with your mind. Honestly, to me, it was like that was just an hour ago. Maybe an hour and a half. Jonah squinted at her. 3 weeks felt like an hour to you? He said. Because I wasn't in time, as JB calls it, Angela said. He took me into this place called Outer Time, where we can spy on all of history. It's hard to describe, but it was kind of like being in an airplane and looking down on everything happening down on the ground. Or, I don't know, like Google Earth, where you can focus in close on one spot, then zoom out and get the broader view too. So JB and Hodge and Gary can zip back and forth through time, Jonah said, with a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. They could go back and, I don't know, tackle me as I'm walking into the cave a little bit ago, sending me backward, or forward in time that way. The feeling of hopelessness was coming back. He pictured himself being sent back and forth endlessly, JB and Hodge fighting over him for centuries. No, Angela said, it doesn't work that way. There's something else JB called the paradox of the doubles. No one can live through a particular time more than once. So, for example, there couldn't have been 2 or 3 copies of JB jumped in from 2 or 3 different times, waiting at the back of the cave to attack Gary, or 2 or 3 copies of me either. That made Jonah feel a little better. And, Angela continued, I don't pretend to understand all of this, but because of your plane crashing into our time where it didn't belong, where it changed lots of people's lives, because of that, we've all been living through what's known as damaged time. Kind of like a nuclear wasteland, maybe. When Mr. Hodge said that he couldn't get to you for all those 13 years, he really meant it. Time travelers couldn't get in at all for a long time, and they could only see limited moments in time, like some birthday party where you drank lots of Mountain Dew, Jonah. Jonah flushed with embarrassment. I was only 10, he wanted to protest, but Angela was still explaining. And then when they could get in, she said it was only at spots that they called points of damage, places where the pain of the time damage was most intense. Catherine, Jonah, you know how you saw JB at Mr. Reardon's office, how he appeared and disappeared? Yeah, Jonah said. Catherine just nodded. That's because those were the only spots he could go to. Mr. Reardon was standing in the bathroom when he found out about the plane landing. And his boss was standing by that desk when he learned about the plane disappearing. So those were openings for JB, Angela said. But the other janitor came out into the waiting room, Jonah said, the guy who gave me the Mountain Dew. He truly was just a janitor for the FBI, Angela said. JB bribed him to help. At least that meant that the other janitor wasn't still hiding in the back of the cave, waiting to jump into action. Probably not anyway. So when JB gave us the file of names, what did he want us to do with it? Jonah asked. He was just trying to temporarily increase the damage so he could get closer to you, Angela said. He didn't expect you to be enterprising enough to take pictures of the files and call the phone numbers and meet with me. Catherine was grinning. I'm the one who thought of taking the pictures, she whispered to Emily, even though Emily couldn't possibly have known what she was talking about. But all your Enterprise just gave Gary an opening to try and grab you at the library, Angela said. He had too many people in the same room at the same time with connections to the mysterious plane. And then you had those printouts of the witnesses and survivor lists. I don't really understand how it works, but it created a huge doorway. Catherine's grin faded a little. Jonah was still trying to put it all together. Who sent the letters, he asked, JB or Hodge? They each sent one, Angela said, again, so they could get close to you. But they were racing each other, so they wrote the letters back in the 1990s on ancient computers programmed for automatic printout. They routed their messages through the mailrooms of giant corporations, so your letters went through machines set up to automatically stuff envelopes with bills or credit card offers. But the letters came in plain white envelopes, Jonah said. Well, they programmed that, Angela said. They worked the way they wanted it to. But the old computers cut off parts of their messages, so they had to use other methods as well. That was probably why they resorted to putting Post-it notes on the adoption papers, Jonah thought. But then when Jonah saw the mysterious figure searching his room, when Chip's computer files vanished, was that just to increase the damage? Each unexplained event had made Jonah and Chip and Catherine more paranoid and worried and scared. Had the other kids faced similar mysteries? Did it even matter who had done these things, JB or Hodge? Angela was still talking. It took JB a long time to figure out that Hodge had chosen this adoption conference to steal you back, she said. JB thinks Hodge must have set up this cave 20 years ago, before the start of damaged time. He just had to trust that everything would stay ready. Then Hodge and Gary broke hundreds of rules, arranging for kids to move here so they could pick up everyone at once. JB had to scramble to find all the addresses by looking at property records from the future. This is confusing. JB felt dizzy, trying to figure out all the connections through time, future, past. The words didn't have the same meanings he'd always counted on. In this strange new framework, the future could be the present, and the past could be the future. And, oh, I see, Catherine said, as if she understood everything. That's why it looked like the FBI knew Daniela McCarthy's new address before her parents had even made an offer on the house. Angela nodded. Property transactions weren't always recorded accurately, she said. Normally, time travelers don't do things like that, relying on future addresses to send letters into the past. But this was a desperate case because of Hodge and Gary. JB says they totally mucked up time. Jonah could kind of picture it. He remembered a Boy Scout hike once where his troop had come upon a clear, shallow stream. Jonah and a bunch of the other boys had jumped in and raced around, splashing each other, even scooping up mud balls to throw at each other. The scoutmaster had given them a long lecture about disrupting nature, and by the end of it, Jonah felt guilty about how many protozoans they had probably killed. Protozoans are like little creatures that live in the water that are microscopic. He could see how time could be like that clear stream. Probably Chip's family wasn't supposed to move. Probably some other family was supposed to be in the house down the street from Jonah's house. But there had been at least 12 families who moved, at least 12 families whose lives were changed. No, 36 families, Jonah thought, with a sudden lump in his throat. Mom and Dad weren't supposed to adopt me. Were they supposed to adopt some other kid? Was Catherine supposed to have a brother at all? Catherine seemed to be thinking along the similar lines. So even if JB managed to fix all the time in the past, even if he sent all the kids back, how would he fix all the damage now? She asked in a thick voice. How would he tell my parents they don't have a son anymore? I don't know, Angela admitted. He's really worried about my non-existent 5 kids, too. The way he acts, you'd think one of them was going to be president someday. Jonah squinted off toward the other side of the room, thinking. Just then, he heard screams and saw kids jumping up in the group gathered around Gary. No, not just kids, Gary himself. Hey, Jonah screamed, who untied Gary? For that, improbably, was what seemed to have happened. With the ropes dragging uselessly behind him, Gary was racing across the room. Some kids aren't smart enough to know the future's only choice, Gary shouted. But somehow Jonah had expected them all to vote on their decision. Didn't everyone believe in a democracy? Suddenly he realized where Gary was headed. Chip! Jonah yelled, watch out! Gary was already slamming against Chip, jerking the taser out of his hands. before Chip had time to react. Gary whirled around, running again. He pointed the taser at Jonah. No, he was pointing it at Catherine. Ah! Catherine screamed, crashing to the floor. The elucidator dropped from her hand. Jonah bent down to pick it up, but Gary was already there, pulling it away and punching in instructions, it seemed. He tucked the taser under his arm and pounded in a whole string of coding on the elucidator. Then he looked up, smirking in JB's direction. Too bad, loser, JB said mockingly. I guess some of us are just better at being persuasive. No, you can't, JB gasped. Do the age reversal first, Mr. Hodge suggested from across the room, completely ignoring JB. This group will be easier to deal with as babies. Yes, sir, Gary said, grinning broadly as he punched more buttons. He took a step back and pointed the elucidator towards Jonah and Catherine and all the other kids gathered around Angela. You feel well enough to stand up yet, sweetie? He said to Catherine, who was sprawled on the floor, recovering from the taser blast. Emily was bent over here, quietly pulling the barbs out. That would make things a little easier for me. Catherine lifted her head. I'm not Daniela McCarthy, she screamed. She had tears in her eyes. Being tasered must truly hurt. I lied. I'm not one of your missing kids from history. I'm just his sister. She pointed at Jonah. You have to let me go. You have to let everyone go. And we're going to stop there for today because this chapter is long. So we will finish tomorrow. So now we know there's this struggle between will they go to the future, will they go to the past? They're not giving them the option to stay in the present. And Catherine has just revealed that she is not Daniela. And will that make a difference in the plan of Mr. Hodge? We will find out.